Welcome to Mr. Gustavuson's lecture of today's history class. This is Unit 6.2, which will cover Central Europe. This lecture, along with the next three, will cover the 1600s of European history. And the 1600s of European history is summed up in one word that you should write down: absolutism. Absolutism is the idea that arose in the 1600s that a king should have absolute power. If you remember from before that under feudalism, the king technically has all the power, but the lords control the army and the lords provide him with the military aid. So if the king wants to use the army, he has to ask permission from the lords. And the lords, having control of the army, can overthrow the king at any point, which made the structure more balanced between the king and the lords. They had to negotiate and come to agreements before they can really get anything done. Under absolutism, the army ties back directly to the king, giving the king all of the control. Absolutism began in the 1600s with an event called the 30 Years' War. Remember before then, after the 1530, then the Catholics and the Protestants had peace in Europe. Holy Roman Emperor Charles V created a condition in which every state in the Holy Roman Empire can choose to be either Catholic or Protestant. And each one chose, and the Holy Roman Empire, or Germany, was divided between the two religions. Eventually, they started forming their own leagues because they feared the other side, and they both feared Calvinism too. Nobody liked those guys. The Protestants formed it in 1608, and the Catholics formed it in 1609, so tensions were getting pretty high. Eventually, tensions got super high in 1618, when there was a riot in the Bohemian city of Prague, and this riot culminated in an event called the Second Defenestration of Prague. The first defenestration of Prague was when the Hussites rebelled against their Catholic overlords and threw them out the window and killed them. The second one was when the Protestants rebelled against their Catholic overlords in Prague and threw them out the window, though in this case they survived. The Catholics say that they survived because they were helped by angels, whereas the Protestants say they survived because they landed in a giant pile of manure. Most historians agree that it's not that miraculous if you survive falling out of a second-story window. People have done it before. It's really weird. If I had a nickel for every time the anti-Catholics threw Catholics out the window in Prague, I'd have 2 nickels.
Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right?
At this point in time in Europe, a powerful family called the Habsburgs came to fruition. They controlled all of Spain, Austria, and thanks to their golden boy Charles V, or Carlos Habsburg, then the Habsburgs had also controlled the Holy Roman Empire. And a lot of people didn't like it. The Habsburgs were a very, very devout Catholic family. They ruled the Spanish Empire, which was very fanatical in the way it ruled over the world. So this event, the Second Defenestration of Prague, led to a war that lasted 30 years, hence the term 30 Years' War. And this war was just straight up barbaric. To put it in perspective, the main fighters in the war were Austria, France, Sweden, and even England got involved a little bit, and yet the majority of the war was fought in Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire. And so it became a German civil war, but it was really just a bunch of Europeans fighting each other in Germany. You had some Habsburg victories for a while that crushed the Czech uprising, and then eventually, however, the war just dragged out so long and it was so painful that the German people were pretty much exhausted from it. Soldiers would march through their villages, and they would take any food they had, and if their armies were running low, they would take any boys that they had, and if they needed some servants, they would take any girls that they had as well. It was pretty much soldiers, both Protestant and Catholics, going throughout the land of Germany and just pillaging every village they can find. Cities were sacked like crazy. The famous one was the sack of Brandenburg, where the city's population went from like 2,000 to 500 in a single night. And it was a really, really rough war. But it changed a lot. In 1630, Sweden joined the war. And the king of Sweden at this time was Gustavus Adolphus. He was the grandson of Gustav Vasa, who we talked about before. Gustavus Adolphus was also called the Lion of the North, and he was a legendary king for his military prowess as well as his virtue. He turned the tide of the war in a famous battle known as the Battle of Brightonfield. The novel 1632 has a very, very vivid description of that battle, and I'll put a link to that in Canvas if I can find it. But this Battle of Brightonfield was known as a revolutionary battle. It laid the foundation of modern warfare because Gustavus Adolphus had this idea, and this idea was that armies should be professional. There was a lot of different systems up until that point where they would try to decide where a country's military force should come from. For example, in the feudal system, the bulk of your army would be levied from farmers, and then the knights would lead the army, they with their cavalry charges. Knights were paid to fight all day, but they were actually sworn to their lord. And when they weren't fighting, they would basically either be training in tournaments or else be police officer-like people. With the decline of feudalism, this knights system went away, but Gustavus Adolphus figured, well, what if I combine an infantry army, like the kind that was used to defeat the knights at Agincourt? If I combine an infantry army with the military culture that the knights had, and create a group of people who are paid by the government, their payment comes directly from me, and they serve their country and only their country. No other country can pay them more to sway them over to their side. So he combined the system of feudalism in the knights with the mercenary system that other countries were using at the time to create the world's first professional army. And he used that to destroy the Habsburgs in some very decisive battles. And then he got shot in 1632. So Sweden had to be taken out of the war. Gustavus Adolphus had a daughter named Christina who actually decided that she was going to be a Catholic instead of a Protestant. So she tried to undo the Reformation in Sweden, but fortunately for the Protestants, she chose not to get married and never to have kids, and so the Vasa family line, at least in Sweden, died out right here and was replaced by a different family that we'll talk about later. Another person who we'll also talk about later was a man named Cardinal Richelieu. Now, the 30 Years' War was primarily a religious war, but as it happened, there was a cardinal who really, really hated the Habsburgs. His name was Cardinal Richelieu. A cardinal, by the way, is a very, very important person in the Catholic Church. To put it in perspective, the only office in the Catholic Church higher than a cardinal is the Pope, and cardinals have the potential to become the Pope. So here you have this cardinal, Cardinal Richelieu, deciding that he wants to destroy the most prominent Catholic family, and so he actually convinced the French monarchy to betray the Catholic side and fight with the Protestants just because he hated the Habsburgs that much, and he feared them. And given that the France and Spain had gone to war a lot at this point, that was a very justified fear. And so Richelieu actually played a huge part in the rise of absolutism, but he also started a trend in France where France would distance themselves from the Catholic Church and eventually distance themselves from Christianity entirely. And so in 1635, Richelieu chose to start fighting against the Habsburgs. So, question: what was the 30 Years' War in Germany fought over? And this will be on the test. So after 30 years, they signed a peace treaty saying that showing what the world would look like, and the peace was a huge breather for the German people, but the war was so horrifying. This is said to be the most destructive war Germany has ever faced. I need to put that in perspective. Germany was one of the prime battlefields of World War II, the most destructive war ever, and yet they say for Germany, this was the most destructive war. Their population went from 20 million to 16 million, their economy was completely ruined, but more importantly, they really lost their faith. And I bring this up a lot, but when a war is particularly destructive for people, the people will become cynical. They'll start to lose their faith in their deity or what they believed in, and they start to lose their will to push forward in general. Germany actually went through this after World War II as well. Some would say that they're still going through this. But the Germans took so long to get back on their feet. The reunification of Germany didn't happen until 1871. But anyways, so as a result of this war, this will be in the cause and effect questions on the test. So this war severely weakened the power of the Habsburgs, but it didn't completely destroy them, as we'll talk about later. It made France a dominant power, and it basically led to the rise of nationalism. And as we mentioned before, nationalism is when people are loyal to their nation or to who they are rather than what their religion is or what king they've sworn loyalty to. In many cases, nationalism is determined by what language you speak and what ethnic group you are. With this massive religious war, then religion as a force in politics really started to decline. And so these nations that came out of this war, here's a map of Europe after the 30 Years' War. These nations started, at this point in time, the world was still trying to transition out of the feudal era. The lords were doing everything they could to keep the peasants under their control and not their kings. Now, throughout the Middle Ages, the lord's greatest strength was the castles he was given. Because if a king wanted to declare war, if the lord wanted to rebel against their kings, and the lords wanted to do whatever they want, the kings would have to come in and try to get them out of their castles, which was very, very difficult. Castles were very, very well fortified. That is until the invention of cannons. And I'm not talking about those primitive cannons that John Ziska used. Those were like giant shotguns that just shot a bunch of pellets. These were actual big, huge cannons. Movies do not do a very good job in explaining how great and mighty of weapons the cannons were, except for the Patriot. Artillery and cannons were very, very useful, especially because if the enemy had a fortress, you can actually, if you were skilled, you can knock down their walls with fortresses. Or you can use all that gunpowder to make bombs to just blow their walls apart. It didn't work very often because they can shoot you down, but when it did work, it was glorious. And so all of this led to the decline of the power of lords and the rise of the power of the absolute kings, the absolute monarchs. The Habsburgs were really, really good at this. They rose up Austria to become a great power, and they also had all the power in Spain, though this kind of worked to Spain's downfall. You see, the Habsburgs, because the kings had all the power, the nobles were pretty much trying to hold on to their positions since their castles could no longer protect them, so they would just do whatever the king wanted. And the king would end up getting surrounded by a bunch of nobles, and the nobles would just be a bunch of psychopaths, and a psychopath is someone who just does whatever they feel like will make people like them, or they just suck up to authority. The nobles would do that, and it ended up creating a weaker country because the king had less of an understanding of what was going on, because the nobles would only give the king good news and turn the royalty into an echo chamber and talk about how awesome the king was. The nobles would also try to convince themselves they were important without this feudal system, and they would have like fancy parties and go to fancy dances. In fact, the biggest impact the Habsburgs have on your guys' lives is that the Habsburgs invented dances. The waltz is from Austria, and then in the New World they invented a lot of the other dances people associate with dances, and they even had dance cards actually. And so now, as Austria grew, a country in the north called Prussia grew. The Prussians were the descendants of the Teutonic Knights. The Teutonic Knights, I mentioned before, were knights that were so powerful in battle that they would wear horns in their helmet, deliberately giving themselves a disadvantage because it looked cool and because they could afford to have that disadvantage. So a powerful family called the Hohenzollern built up a massive army and became absolute monarchs. And the leader of this was a man named Frederick Hohenzollern, or Frederick the Great. He's pretty much the father of Prussia. By the way, the nation of Prussia is now called Germany. So his country still exists to this day. But he believed that a ruler should be like a father to his people, and that he should go out and basically have a strong personal tie to his army, because at this point the army was the king's army. They didn't tie back to their lords, they tied back straight to their king, giving the king all the power. So here's a question that will be on the test. List the two main causes of the War of Austrian Succession. I'm going to give you the answer to that pretty soon. You see, Charles Habsburg VI did not have any sons, and he didn't have any immediate brothers who could take over the throne from him, the throne to Austria. And so he had a daughter instead. And his daughter's name was Maria Theresa, and she's actually one of the greatest queens Austria's ever had. But at the time, a lot of the Europeans were thinking, oh, we don't want a female ruler. We don't want a queen. We want a king. And he had some male cousins who definitely wanted to be king, but he says, nope, Maria Theresa is in charge of Austria. And Austria, if you look at the map from before, Austria actually kind of shared land with the Holy Roman Empire. Normally this wasn't a problem because the Austrian king would always end up being the Holy Roman Emperor, but the Holy Roman Emperor was an elected position, and the electors did not want a queen, they wanted a king. So they chose one of her distant cousins or cousin once removed or something like that. And so now we had this fighting over this land, and they signed a treaty to diffuse the war. But then Frederick the Great decided that he really wanted this land in the north called Silesia. And so people were saying, oh, should we back Frederick the Great's claim or should we back Austria's claim? And this leads to a concept I want to bring up to you guys. This concept is called the Concert of Europe. European politics at this time had one rule. If somebody gets too powerful, they need to go. And so every European country was watching every other European country and doing everything they could to make sure that country doesn't get too strong. And so all of the other European countries, when this little thing happened, where it was who's going to get stronger, Prussia or Austria, when this little thing happened, every country needed to get involved. And that's why we had the War of the Austrian Succession, which was where France and Prussia decided to fight against Austria and Great Britain. So England decided they didn't want Prussia getting too strong. England hated France. And so when France decided to fight against Austria, because as you remember, Cardinal Richelieu set up a policy in France to hate the Habsburgs no matter what. So when France says, yeah, let's go screw the Habsburgs over and side with Prussia, England says, okay, we don't want France to be on the winning side of this war, so let's side with the Habsburgs to fight France. That was the War of the Austrian Succession. So the two causes of this was the king having no male heir and making Maria Theresa empress, and Prussia deciding to take advantage of a crisis and try to take the land. So the result of this war was that Prussia got to keep the land they took, and Spain got a little bit of land. Outside of that, the war was pretty much a stalemate. There wasn't a lot of difference between the two. But this war set the stage for when they had a chance to start another war called the 7 Years' War. And what you'll notice on this slide is that the 7 Years' War, then suddenly Great Britain and Prussia were on the same side. What happened was England's royal family started marrying into the Prussian royal family. This is where King George of England comes from, the one from the American Revolution. They started marrying Prussian women, and they became a Prussian or a Germanic family. So now England was on Prussia's side, and France decides they hate England, so they're on Austria's side, and then they get Russia involved for some reason. Oh yeah, Russia really hated Prussia. So Russia hated Prussia, and so they jumped in on Austria's side. So the sides switched. And again, this is the concert of Europe. When one side gets too big, then the other side has to take over. It was actually Prussia that started this war, or specifically Frederick. He attacked a kingdom of Saxony, which Austria swore to protect. And so there was war all across the place, and really a lot of this happened because everybody wanted to take each other's colonies. In fact, the borders of Europe in this war did not even change, but the borders of the rest of the world did. See, the 7 Years' War should actually be called the First World War because it spread across the whole world. The only reason people don't call it the First World War, I guess because no one thought of it at the time, they called World War I, but also because even though it spread across the world, all of the fighters were predominantly European. But it spread into India and even North America. You see, you're probably wondering, does this affect me in any way? I know what is the 7 Years' War? How does it affect me? Well, in America, the 7 Years' War is called the French and Indian War. So you're probably thinking, well, how does this affect me? Well, England in the colonies there were two men who rose to great power as a result of this war. Their names were George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. That's right. The 7 Years' War is also called the French and Indian War. So in Europe, none of the borders changed, but in America, they did. England took Canada. England took all their colonies and became the dominant power in the new land of America. And this is because of the two great minds who helped England win that war over here, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. So all of this happened. All of this rise of American power and rise of American strength happened because Frederick the Great invaded a land that Austria was protecting. This rise of Prussian power led to the rise of American power because it allowed these two men, George Washington, who won the war with his army, and Benjamin Franklin, who won the war with his words, to rise up. And while England promoted them for their skill, what England didn't realize is that they had completely different ideas on how a government should be run. Frederick the Great attacking Saxony was what helped create America. And in addition to that, there was another guy who rose up to power as a result of this war because he was a tax collector. His name was Samuel Adams. You see, England needed to raise America's taxes to pay for this 7 Years' War. And the rest is history. This is where the American Revolution comes from. So a question for the test, what was the 7 Years' War called in North America? And the answer is the French and Indian War. That was the driving question in the 1600s, is how much power should a king have? At no point was the driving question ever, should we even have kings in the first place? It was always, how much power should a king have? The reason for this is because monarchy was still the default form of government, and actually, there's one advantage that monarchy has over any other form of government. And that advantage, and this will be a test question, is monarchy is the most stable form of government. Unlike a republic where people would vote in elections, and prior to America, it was normal for people to contest the elections and throw out the results and then just try to take power by force anyways. In a monarchy, the king chooses a successor, or there's a law of who the king's successor could be, and then we know who the leader's going to be. It didn't always create peace, but it had a better track record of creating peace than any other form of government. So there was no question we should have kings. The question is, how much power should a king have? And most countries decided their answer was all of it.